I thought I was driving home to check fences, look over a few cattle contracts, and maybe sit on my father's old porch with a cup of coffee. Instead, I found a luxury golf course sitting on top of my family's land. Not part of it, not near it, directly on it. And the woman running the place calmly informed me that I had supposedly sold the property years earlier. The only problem was I never sold a single acre. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 49 years old, and until a few years ago my life was about as predictable as a man's life can get. My family had owned a ranch outside a small town in central Oklahoma for generations. My great-grandfather bought the first section of that land after coming home from the war. My grandfather expanded it. My father spent 40 years turning it into a working cattle operation, and I always assumed one day I'd grow old doing the same thing. Then life got in the way. In early 2020, my mother suffered a major stroke. My younger sister lived in Washington State and needed help caring for her, so I packed a few bags, hired extra help for the ranch, and headed north. At the time, I figured I'd be gone a few months. A few months became a year. A year became nearly 3. During that period, my father passed away unexpectedly. Losing him while already caring for my mother hit me harder than I like to admit. There's some phone calls you never really recover from, and that was one of them. His will transferred everything to me, the ranch, the equipment, the grazing leases, all of it. Even from Washington, I stayed on top of things. Property taxes were paid every year. Insurance was current. My ranch foreman, a guy named Carl Benson who had worked alongside my dad for over 20 years, sent me monthly reports and photos. Everything looked normal. Sure, I missed home, but home seemed to be waiting for me. Then in August of 2023, my mother finally stabilized enough that I could spend some extended time back in Oklahoma. I remember the drive like it happened yesterday. I crossed the county line just after sunrise. The roads were familiar. The fields were familiar. Even the old gas station where Dad used to buy chewing tobacco was still there. For the first hour, I was smiling like an idiot. Then I turned on a Ranch Road 12, and everything changed. At first, I thought I had taken a wrong turn. There was a massive stone entrance where my south pasture should have been. Decorative landscaping, water fountains, iron gates, a sign that Red Cedar Ridge Estates Golf and Country Club. I actually stopped the truck and checked my GPS. Then I checked it again. My stomach started doing that thing it does when your brain realizes something is wrong before your heart catches up. I drove closer. Beyond the gate stretched perfectly manicured fairways, golf carts, sand traps, decorative ponds, expensive houses. And right in the middle of what used to be grazing land sat a giant clubhouse that looked like a luxury resort. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I was losing my mind. I knew every fence line on that property. I had ridden horses across those acres since I was a kid. I knew exactly where I was standing. The problem was that what I was looking at shouldn't have existed. I pulled over and just stared. Men in polo shirts were teeing off where my cattle used to graze. Couples were eating breakfast on a patio built roughly where Dad's old hay storage barn had once stood. It felt like somebody had erased 3 generations of my family's history and replaced it with a country club. Finally, I noticed a number posted beside the gate. I called it. A cheerful woman answered. Cedar Ridge Estates, this is Laura Whitmore. I said, Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. This property belongs to me. There was a brief pause before she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a confident one. Sir, according to our records, this land was legally purchased over 2 years ago. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Purchased from who? Another pause. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Purchased from you. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. My mind was trying to process the sentence and failing. Finally, I managed to ask, what exactly are you talking about? She explained that the Homeowners Association had acquired 28 acres through a development company called Prairie Summit Holdings. The transfer had supposedly occurred in 2021. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything was finalized. According to her, the matter had been settled years ago. I ended the call and sat there in silence. Wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a golf cart rolled across what used to be my family's property. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out copies of my father's records that I always carried. The deed was there. The inheritance documents were there. The tax records were there. Nothing had changed. Legally, that land still belonged to me. Yet somehow an entire luxury development had appeared on top of it. That's when I called my attorney, David Harlan. I told him I needed a title search immediately. At first he thought I was exaggerating. Then I sent him pictures. 10 minutes later he called back. His voice sounded very different. "Ethan," he said quietly, "don't leave town. I think you've just stumbled into something a lot bigger than a property dispute." The next 48 hours felt like I was living inside somebody else's nightmare. David started digging through county records while I checked into a motel 20 minutes from the ranch, because neither of us knew how deep this situation went. I barely slept that first night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw golf carts rolling across my father's pasture. By noon the following day, David called and asked me to come to his office immediately. The second I walked in, I knew the news wasn't good. His desk was covered in paperwork. Deeds, closing statements, transfer records, notary forms. Everything looked official. Everything looked legitimate. And every single page made me feel sicker. David slid a folder across the desk. "Take a look at this." There it was. A sales agreement supposedly signed by me in June of 2021. According to the document, I had agreed to sell 28 acres to a developer named Victor Langford for $940,000. My signature appeared on every page. There was even a notarized acknowledgement. To anyone glancing at it, the deal looked perfectly valid. The problem was that none of it was real. The signature wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. Whoever forged it had clearly copied my name from old records, but failed to imitate the way I actually signed documents. The notary stamp looked authentic too, until David began making calls. Less than an hour later, we learned the notary license number belonged to a woman who had retired 5 years earlier. Even worse, she had died before the alleged closing date. I remember sitting there staring at the paperwork while a strange mix of anger and disbelief washed over me. Someone hadn't merely stolen my land. They had built an entire alternate reality around the theft. David wasn't finished. "Look at the timeline," he said. Victor Langford purchased the property for under $1 million. 3 weeks later, he transferred it to Cedar Ridge Estates for nearly $4 million. $4 million. I almost laughed when I heard the number because it was so absurd. Somehow this guy had turned a forged land deal into a multi-million-dollar payday almost overnight. "Who is he?" I asked. David leaned back in his chair. "Local developer. Aggressive reputation. A lot of political connections. A lot of money." The more we investigated, the uglier the story became. Every document pointed toward a carefully planned operation. Someone had impersonated me during the closing. Someone had provided fake identification. Someone had coordinated fraudulent paperwork. Someone had arranged financial transfers. This wasn't a random scam. It was organized, professional, deliberate. Then David asked a question that changed everything. "Where were you on June 17th, 2021? I didn't even have to think. That date was burned into my memory because it was the week my mother underwent a difficult rehabilitation procedure in Washington. Within hours, we collected proof. Hospital records, hotel receipts, credit card transactions, cell phone location data, surveillance footage from a grocery store. Every piece of evidence placed me nearly 2,000 miles away from Oklahoma on the exact day I supposedly sold my land. By that point, David stopped talking about civil litigation and started talking about criminal fraud. The county district attorney's office became involved almost immediately. Then federal investigators entered the picture because money transfers had crossed state lines. I still remember the first meeting with the federal agents. They didn't look dramatic like people in movies. They looked tired, professional, focused. One of them spread documents across a conference table and said something that stuck with me. "Mr. Mercer, whoever did this got greedy. That's usually how they get caught." The paper trail was enormous. Large transactions, multiple shell companies, fraudulent identification, dozens of signatures, dozens of witnesses. Every attempt to make the scam look legitimate had actually created more evidence. The investigation accelerated quickly. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge Estates continued operating as though nothing was wrong. Golf tournaments were still being held. Memberships were still being sold. The restaurant was still serving dinner every night on land that legally belonged to me. At one point, I drove past the property and watched people laughing on a patio while waiters carried drinks between tables. None of them had any idea they were sitting in the middle of a federal fraud investigation. I wasn't angry at those people. Most were probably decent folks who believed everything was legitimate. My anger was reserved for the people at the top, especially Laura Whitmore. A week after our first phone call, she requested a meeting. We met inside a conference room overlooking the 18th hole. The view was beautiful. That somehow made the conversation worse. Laura walked in carrying a stack of documents and the confidence of someone who still believed she controlled the situation. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we understand you're upset." Upset. That's the word she chose. As if somebody had parked in my driveway. I looked around the room and said, "You built a country club on my family's land." Her expression tightened. "Our association purchased the property in good faith." "Maybe," I replied, "but good faith doesn't magically create ownership." For nearly an hour, she repeated variations of the same argument. They had relied on records. They had invested millions. Hundreds of homeowners were involved. Reversing everything would be devastating. Finally, I leaned forward and asked a simple question. Did anybody ever contact me before spending millions of dollars? Silence. Did anybody verify I actually signed the documents? More silence. Did anybody think it was strange that the original owner never appeared once during construction? She didn't answer because she couldn't. Deep down, she already knew what was coming. A few days later, David sent formal notices demanding immediate cessation of commercial activity on the disputed property. Federal investigators simultaneously expanded their inquiry. That's when things started unraveling for Victor Langford. Financial records exposed hidden transfers. Emails surfaced. Witnesses started cooperating. One contractor admitted seeing a man present identification that seemed suspicious during the original closing. Another witness identified an associate of Langford who had apparently played the role of Ethan Mercer for an afternoon. Every week brought another revelation. Every revelation made the situation worse for the people involved. Then one Tuesday morning, my phone exploded with messages. Friends, former neighbors, even distant relatives were calling. I turned on the television and immediately understood why. Federal agents had arrested Victor Langford at his corporate headquarters shortly after sunrise. News helicopters filmed the entire thing. There he was on every channel in the state, walking in handcuffs toward an unmarked vehicle while reporters shouted questions. Watching that footage felt surreal. For years, this man had been making money from land he never legally owned. Now the entire scheme was collapsing in public. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Developer accused of massive property fraud. Luxury golf community built on stolen ranch land. Federal investigation expands. Suddenly, everyone wanted interviews. Local reporters camped outside the development entrance. Homeowners demanded answers. Investors panicked. The association's board began holding emergency meetings. And almost overnight, Laura Whitmore's tone changed completely. Gone was the confident executive who laughed during our first phone call. Now, she wanted cooperation, understanding, compromise. She claimed the association had been victimized too. In some ways, she wasn't wrong. Many homeowners genuinely had been deceived. But there was one problem. For nearly 3 years, the association had profited from my property. Membership fees, restaurant revenue, event bookings, property value increases. Whether they intended to or not, they had benefited enormously from someone else's land. One afternoon, Laura called and asked if we could find a practical solution. I remember laughing for the first time in weeks. A practical solution? I said, Laura, 3 years ago, a practical solution would have been asking permission before building a golf course on my ranch. The line went quiet because both of us finally understood the same thing. The criminal case was moving fast. The evidence was overwhelming. And for the first time since I returned home, the people who thought they owned my land were beginning to realize they never had. Once the criminal case started gaining momentum, the entire atmosphere around Cedar Ridge Estates changed. The confidence was gone. The expensive smiles were gone. Even the place itself felt different. A few months earlier, it had looked like a monument to success. Now, it looked like a very expensive mistake waiting for a judge's signature. The federal prosecutors moved aggressively. Victor Langford eventually agreed to a plea deal after investigators uncovered enough evidence to bury him at trial. The fraudulent signatures, the fake identification, the shell companies, the money trail. Piece by piece, the illusion collapsed. The man who once strutted through county meetings talking about economic growth and community investment suddenly found himself facing years in federal prison. I wasn't present when he entered his guilty plea, but David called me immediately afterward. I remember standing beside one of my old fence lines as he delivered the news. The wind was moving through the grass, just like it had when my father was alive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then David finally said, "It's over." But it wasn't entirely over. The criminal case answered one question. The civil damages answered another. For months, our legal team calculated every dollar generated from my property. Revenue from golf memberships, revenue from tournaments, revenue from restaurant operations, leasing agreements, promotional events, real estate premiums attached to homes marketed around the golf course. The numbers kept climbing. Every spreadsheet seemed more unbelievable than the last. Eventually, the association requested formal settlement negotiations. This time, they didn't show up acting powerful. They showed up acting nervous. Very nervous. I attended one of the final meetings myself. Laura Whitmore looked 10 years older than when I first met her. At one point, she quietly asked, "What do you actually want, Mr. Mercer?" It was a fair question. I could have demanded closure of the course. I could have pushed for years of additional litigation. I could have tried forcing every structure off the property. But the truth was more complicated. Hundreds of families live there now. Many had no idea how the land had been acquired. Punishing innocent homeowners wouldn't bring my father back. It wouldn't restore lost years. And it wouldn't undo what happened. So we focused on accountability. Real accountability. The final settlement took months to complete, but when everything was signed, the outcome surprised a lot of people. The association agreed to pay substantial retroactive compensation for the years they operated on my land. They agreed to long-term monthly lease payments for continued use of the property. Additional punitive damages were included because the development had profited from land it never legally possessed. Combined with funds recovered through liquidation of Langford's remaining assets, the total package reached several $1,000,000. More importantly, the agreement included strict enforcement provisions. Miss a payment, violate the terms, or attempt another legal trick, and severe consequences would follow immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, the leverage belonged to me. A few weeks after everything was finalized, I drove out to the property alone. No lawyers, no reporters, no investigators, just me. The sun was beginning to set over the fairways. Golf carts were returning to the clubhouse. People were laughing on patios. Glasses clinked. Life moved forward. I parked near the edge of what had once been my father's south pasture and stood there for a long time. It was strange. Part of me still hated seeing a golf course where cattle used to graze. Part of me probably always would. But another part understood something important. This story had stopped being about land a long time ago. It was about ownership, responsibility, truth. People sometimes assume property fraud is a victimless crime because nobody gets hurt physically. They're wrong. When someone steals land, they're stealing history. They're stealing memories. They're stealing years of work that can never be replaced. What Victor Langford tried to take wasn't just acreage. He tried to take 4 generations of family legacy and convert it into a quick profit. In the end, that greed became his downfall. Last I heard, he was preparing to begin serving his federal sentence. Most of his assets were gone. His reputation was destroyed. And the empire he built on deception disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Meanwhile, every month the payment arrives exactly on schedule. Every month I look at that statement and think about my father. Not because of the money. The money is nice, sure. Anybody who says otherwise is lying. But that's not the part that matters. The part that matters is knowing that when somebody tried to erase my family from its own land, they failed. Completely. Sometimes people ask if I forgive the association. Honestly, I don't know. Some of them were victims. Some of them should have asked more questions. Most are probably somewhere in between. That's life. Things are rarely as simple as heroes and villains. But I do know this. If a stranger showed up tomorrow claiming ownership of something your family spent generations building, how far would you go to fight for it? That's the question I still think about. And it's the question I want to leave with you. Was the settlement fair? Or should I have forced the entire development off the property? Do you think the homeowners deserve protection? Or should everyone involved have paid the price for not doing their homework? Let me know what you think in the comments, because even now, years later, people in my town still argue about who the real victims were in this story.